You are listening to Point One, Beyond Human Reality podcast with your host, author
SS Lopez and
Red Foster. That's me.
This podcast is a complement to the book with the same title, Beyond Human Reality, an innocent look into existence and the potential of being human.
Welcome to episode 2 of the show. You are listening to Point One, Beyond Human Reality. We hope you had a good day or a good week, or if you are about to head into a new one, may it be a smooth one for you. So, Sergio, what is on the cards for today's episode?
Today we are going to talk about top-of-the-range airliners, rescue operations and safety commissions, forgotten people in Austria, suicide rates, and the theory of progress, and unnecessary suffering in our societies and why we are so hesitant to look inside ourselves.
Those are a lot of ands. But yes, we are. We are going to talk about all these things. And you may ask yourself what airline safety has to do with suicide rates. But if you stay tuned, we promise to try and connect the dots for you. In the meantime, I would like to remind you to follow us on your preferred social media platform at Point One or SS Lopez Author. I will say, though, we are not on TikTok. So, Instagram or Facebook.
Why not? Why are we not?
I don't know. I can't do the TikTok dances. You know, I'm not very well coordinated. But anyway, you can also get in touch with us via email if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or comments on today's show or any show. And you just want to get in touch in general. Sergio, let's get started. Why don't you tell us about the world of aviation? Listeners, I just want to do a quick side note here. Sergio is an avid fan of everything aviation, and he has an enormous capacity for remembering what I think is pretty useless information and statistics about planes and flights and crashes and all these kinds of things. Yet he cannot remember my shopping list.
I think it's much more important to know exactly where you put in your food when you are flying compared to if you just forgot a butter or something like this. So I am an avid fan of aviation, and I would love to do an entire episode just on planes and flying and so on and so forth.
Thank goodness this is not an aviation podcast, though.
We could talk about which airliner is the best, Airbus, Boeing. I think it would be super interesting.
Or a snooze fest, but okay.
But I promise I won't bore anyone like that. And if we are going to share personal bits here of information, then I can tell you that Red here does not particularly enjoy flying. Not the way I do.
No, not the way you do. And I can't really say why. It's not that I'm afraid of flying per se, but I do find it an increasingly anxious experience. Just, the whole thing, the airport, the security, the amount of time that it takes to get door to door, visas, if you're on a South African passport like me. But yeah, I guess we've flown so much all over the world that there's just no more novelty left in it for me.
Yeah, I have to agree with that because people are flying more and more, and it is difficult to keep all the bureaucracy in order. So you have to really go through security and tickets and all that. So yeah. Although for me it's a little bit different, the experience every time I get on a plane, I marvel at the wonder of air travel. But I agree. It's becoming tiresome. Anyway, let's get into it. So to illustrate my point, or the first point, I want to start off by telling you about a fatal plane crash that happened back in 2009.
A fatal one, yeah.
Yes, but as you know, fatal crashes are actually a rare occurrence. Anyway, on May 31st, 2009, 228 passengers and crew from 32 different countries boarded a later generation Airbus 330 scheduled to fly from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Just so you know, at that time in 2009, the Airbus A330 was probably the most technologically advanced airplane in service. It was to be an 11-hour journey that started at 7:30 p.m. local time. 3 hours into the flight, the cockpit made final radio contact with the area control center in Recife, Brazil. And at that stage, they were very close to a meteorological region along the equator called the intertropical convergent zone. Why is this zone important? Well, it is very important because it is well known in aviation for its belt of converging winds and rising air, which produces high cloudiness, frequent thunderstorms, and heavy rainfall. According to the flight plan, the A330 should have contacted Dakar Oceanic at 11:20, almost 5 hours from the time of takeoff, and they had to confirm the position, but the cockpit failed to do so. Almost 2.5 hours after leaving Brazilian air control, the plane still had not appeared on Dakar's radar screens. Senegalese air traffic control failed to realize that the aircraft had gone missing, and it took time before the alarm was raised that would lead to a later search and rescue mission.
So at this stage, there was not a single trace of this plane, right? It seemed to have evaporated, leaving no radar trace, no mayday, no witnesses, no wreckage.
Absolutely. No measures were spared in the search effort for the aeroplanes. The authorities literally rolled out the big guns. They sent a flotilla of ships, 1 aircraft, a nuclear submarine, a research vessel, including an unmanned deep-water submersible to locate where the wreckage were deployed.
And it took several days, even with all these effort, it took days before there were any clues as to what had happened, right?
Exactly. About 5 days after the plane went missing, fragments of the wreckage along with 50 bodies were found 600 miles off the coast of Brazil. The experts were baffled as to how an expensive and highly sophisticated machine that needs, imagine this, listen, 4 minutes of human operation in an 11-hour flight could have vanished into thin air.
4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's what the pilots get paid to do. 4 minutes of.
It's the time of a coffee.
Wow.
To drink. Well,
that does not inspire any confidence in flying, okay?
Well, I really have to defend these guys, and I have to say that it is really very true that aviation is extremely computerized and sophisticated nowadays, and the autopilot is responsible for the majority of the flight, but these guys keep an eye constantly on every single level, on every single gauge. Absolutely. And they prepare the flight before taking off, and they leave the aeroplane absolutely ready when they land. It is really a huge responsibility. And of course, you need to know how to fly these things. You can go into a cockpit. You can see everything. It was definitely a tragedy. Everyone on board was killed, and families in the aeronautic industry were desperate for answers as to why such a catastrophe had happened. And at that time, we have to remember that more than 600 Airbus 330s were in service worldwide
every
daily.
Day, yeah.
So it was critical to determine if something was wrong with the model and what had caused the fatal crash. I remember very well, very vividly, the unease and the anxiety that this particular crash caused among industry professionals and passengers. And it was of vital importance for the industry and the families to know and to understand what had gone wrong, not only to save lives, but in order to keep the business going. I mean, this is one of the industries, they don't have the luxury of turning a blind eye to their own mistakes.
Mm-hmm. But so unfortunately, it almost took 2 years to find some answers. And wasn't it the same crew that found the wreck of the Titanic in 1985 that discovered this plane?
Yes, it was. In April 2011, they found the shattered fuselage, 13,000 feet down on the seabed, and it contained the bodies of more than 100 passengers. And they also finally found the black boxes, and they were able to piece together the puzzle of what happened to the flight.
It's an awful, awful thing, an awful find for them. Didn't you tell me, or I think I read somewhere, that the search and recovery mission for this flight came at a cost of nearly $32 million?
Yes, around that. Yeah, pretty penny. Yeah.
Wow, $32 million. Just, I mean, it's an impossible amount of money. Just think about what can be done with $32 million.
Indeed, but like I said, for the airline industry, it is vital to understand why accidents happen. Human lives are at stake, and with more and more people having access to air travel, one could argue that it is a necessary investment. Let me just connect here by talking about safety in aviation. It quite simply is the safest way of traveling.
I'm not sure about, if the Google search that I did is to be believed, only 1 in several million flight accidents are actually fatal. And if you compare that to car accidents or car crashes, then your chances of dying in a car crash is 1 in 114.
Statistically speaking, it is. In 2017, for example, the safest year ever, the number of deaths attributed to airline accidents worldwide was just 59. Compare that number to the number of road traffic deaths globally in 2016, and the mind boggles. 1.5 million people lost their lives. 2019 presented a total of 287 fatalities on commercial aircraft carrying 14 or more.
Mm-hmm. A lot of these accidents do happen on private airlines, I read. So no danger there for us to be in an accident.
I think so. I agree with that.
Of course, this year with the pandemic, it would be interesting to see what the numbers look like now with the severe reduction in air travel. I'm sure that number now is close to zero.
I suppose we have to wait till the end of the year, but logic suggests that the numbers are going to be very low because there hasn't been a lot of people flying, and all in all, the probability of being involved in an aviation accident, especially a fatal one, is extremely, extremely low. And this is greatly thanks to the meticulous and thorough examination of accidents after they have occurred. Aviation knows very well that safety interacts narrowly with operational and management systems, and that most accidents result from multiple failures in one or various systems.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that there is this scrutiny of the entire system. It's not just, they don't just look at the plane, but they look at everything surrounding the plane. There's a lot of detail and a lot of effort is being put into understanding every single component that makes up the flight system.
Correct. It's a holistic approach. Mm-hmm. They call it the Swiss cheese model, which means that for an accident to occur, we tend to think that something goes wrong, it doesn't matter what it is, and then everything goes south from that point on. It is not like that. For an accident to occur, all the safety failures or failures in safety defenses need to line up similar to how the holes in multiple slices of Swiss cheese line up. Aviation safety experts attempt to identify the complex chain of events associated with an accident using different approaches, and not only one. I mean, they are not limited to causal models that focus on anticipating problems, or collision risk models, or human error models. They have many, many more models that they can rely on. In the industry, safety is paramount to keep flyers safe and fill aircrafts. Mm-hmm. That's why the industry takes any incident very seriously and dedicates massive resources to examine, explore, and scrutinize any catastrophe.
$32 million.
Exactly. Several governments intensively collaborated in the search and rescue of the 330, sparing no trouble or expense. Now, today, we have a very detailed list of explanations of why it happened. We know, for example, that the A330 passed into clouds associated with an extensive system of thunderstorms through the intertropical convergence zone, and its speed sensors, called pitot, got clogged by thick ice, and that the autopilot disengaged, leaving the least experienced of the two co-pilots in total control of the aircraft. Both co-pilots got confused while the captain was resting and finally lost control of the airplane due to incorrect reactions to the sudden loss of instrumentation.
So we know all of that from the black boxes, right? Like, even though this happened several years ago and it took years to find those black boxes, we have quite an incredible amount of detail about
exactly
what happened.
When you can't retrieve the black boxes, you're going to have the full pictures because they retain all the data that happened during the flight. And not only that, but there are other methods. We have a lot of information, and that information is used and analyzed and scrutinized in order to understand what happened. And when you understand what had happened, then you can start to make decisions to solve the problems, try to avoid that this thing never happens again. And this is exactly why today no airline pilot will ever make the same mistake again. They will know exactly what to do the instant a stall warning alarm sounds at cruise altitude. And they will pay closer attention to the weather patterns in the flight path and will communicate clearly who is in charge when the two co-pilots are alone in the cockpit. They will understand the alternate low parameters and will practice hand flying the aircraft during all phases of the flight. So it is very important to keep in mind that investigators and authorities never gave up until the truth came to light. And these efforts prevented hundreds of potential fatalities that could have caused the loss of thousands of human lives, with personal stories and families and friends to return to. And all those human beings had dreams, desires, goals, and all of them needed to be loved and cared for. And above all, every one of them deserved to be protected from any harm.
And if you look at it from that point of view, then an investment of millions of dollars suddenly seems more justified, and these are expensive lessons learned, but we are hopeful, or how wonderful is it to see that these lessons will inform future
Correct.
decisions. Anyway, if these kinds of details interest you, and if you are also somewhat of a enthusiast of all things aviation, then you can read more about this in the introduction of the book. So please check it out. But now, Sergio, what does all of this have to do with Austrian people and the suicide rate?
Well, of course, you know this, but the listeners don't. I spent nearly 10 years living in Austria. It was quite the experience for a Spaniard. The people, the culture, the mentality is vastly different from my own. In Austria, I really came to understand people in a way that until that point I hadn't. After nearly a decade living there, I decided to take a job in South Africa, which is a little bit different. And it was January 2008 when I was having my farewell dinner with a dear Spanish friend. And I remember talking about our Christmas holidays and fantasizing about my new life on the African continent. And there was a pause, a very, very weird break. And out of the blue, she looked at me and quietly said, I am still having trouble understanding how a person can die alone in his apartment and nobody would notice his absence until his body started to decompose. My neighbors called the police just because they were bothered by the smell.
Wow. Nobody knew that he was gone. Nobody had noticed his absence.
She told me that the middle-aged man who lived in her building had passed away, and for more than 2 weeks nobody had noticed that he was missing. It was only when the smell got unbearable that the neighbors on the same floor decided to call the authorities.
That's incredible. I mean, how do you digest something like that?
At that time, I remember having mixed emotions about the situation. On the one hand, I experienced sadness, despair, and brokenheartedness for him, dying alone without anyone by his side as he was looking death in the eye. On the other hand, knowing the social code as well as I did, I wasn't surprised at all about what had happened to him. If I'm perfectly honest, I even faced certain emotions of indifference towards him. In welfare states like Austria, there are no shortages of jobs, and the network of social and public services are excellent. In a truly Austrian mindset, I briefly told myself that it was probably his choice. Perhaps he preferred to be left alone. But of course, I didn't really convince myself of that. As a matter of fact, the book was largely inspired by that event. I was deeply touched, and I think about that conversation all the time.
And subsequently, you have done quite a bit of research on suicide, haven't you?
Yes, I have. It turned into an important topic, not just for the book, but in general. I discovered that according to the World Health Organization, it is estimated that close to 16 million people attempt suicide every year. That is one person every 2 seconds. And that one person every 40 seconds finally succeeds to terminate his or her existence, making a total of 800,000 deaths a year. At the time of speaking is, I think, 1.3, 1.4 COVID deaths. So it's more than half. And that is more lives lost than people who die from malaria, breast cancer, war, or homicide.
And yet all of those things have big commissions and big money behind them and big campaigns to prevent that.
And big cover pages, newspapers and publications, online publications, exactly. And it is the second leading cause of death in 15 to 29-year-olds in the world.
Yeah.
So the youth is really suffering a lot under that. And surprisingly enough, the highest suicide rates are found in high-income countries at rates as high as 11.5 per 100,000 people. Just as an example, in the US, the national suicide rate rose by 25% between 1999 and 2016.
Yes, and with the COVID pandemic and 2020 being the year that it has been, I'm sure that is now even perhaps higher. Just this morning, I was preparing for this podcast and I saw a headline by CNN that says that in the month of October alone, more people died from suicide in Japan than the entire COVID pandemic. So more lives were lost in the month of October, I think, to around 2,100 suicide versus about 2,080 COVID-related deaths throughout the entire pandemic, which, started in the East earlier than it had here in Europe. It's quite incredible in 1 month.
That's incredible. I hadn't read that, but that just illustrates my point perfectly. And this is where the stark contrast to aviation disasters shows up. When people commit suicide, there are no $1 million funds to invest in finding out why. There are no multinational coordinated efforts to identify ways to proactively determine how changes in our social, political, and economic systems affect the risk of suicide. And it seems that governments and international organizations cannot recognize that the interaction of those systems and their failure are causing a suicide pandemic. So we do have a couple of causal models focusing on anticipating problems and some suicide risks models.
But nowhere near as elaborate as models that are in existence for aviation disasters.
Of course not. Of course not. And unfortunately, research, even having those models, research shows that 9 out of 10 licensed mental health providers cannot even pass a basic competency exam in suicide risks management and intervention. So the result of this is a global pandemic. We have more than 264 million people of all ages suffering from depression. And we know very well that depression is one of the leading causes of disability worldwide, with extremely well-established connections to suicide, together with one or more acts of attempted termination of life or self-harm.
Yeah, especially amongst young people nowadays. The self-harm is a very hot topic.
Exactly. In 2017, there were more than twice as many suicides as there were homicide. And what do we do? Or let's ask ourselves, what do governments do and authorities? As an example, for 2021, the US government requested a budget of more than, and listen to this, $942.2 million to strengthen federal law enforcement's ability to counter violent crime and support communities to prevent violent crime, which is okay. But if you look at the National Institutes of Health statistics, a meager $100 million were spent on suicide research last year.
So they literally are willing to spend more than 9 times the amount of money on something that takes half of the lives, which is violent crime and homicide. And I'm not saying that's okay. I'm just saying, gosh, what a discrepancy.
This is enormous. I mean, 10 times. We can almost say that they are looking the other way. Exactly. We are looking the other way. And in the meantime, we suffer under our current health systems that basically focus on diseases rather than people. And they cannot identify the mental health problems of more than half of Americans who have died by suicide because they were either not diagnosed or didn't have access to treatment. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even started to talk about stress, anxiety, mood, and substance abuse disorders. If you compare these to all the detailed information and recommendation for the future safety we have on the Brazilian flight about what happened and what exactly went wrong in a fairly unique occurrence, but we don't seem to know and we don't seem to care to dive into the same level of detail for human unnecessary suffering.
This baffles me. I mean, my mind is just blown by this. I guess I've never thought about it. You often hear me moan and groan about things like how much money footballers make and how much money celebrities make. Correct. And, you know, how my opinion is that money can be better spent elsewhere. But this is just, it's unbelievable. And it begs the question, you know, why is there no Swiss cheese model for suicide? Why is there no holistic approach to the systems that inform human suffering? How is it possible that we approach human suffering and death so differently? We are going to take a short break, and when we get back, we will talk about something called the theory of progress. So, Sergio, just before the break, I asked you why you think it is that something as statistically unique and fairly uncommon as a plane crash enjoys so much more time and resources and effort than the very real and harsh realities human beings face around the lack of support for mental health issues and suicide.
Well, one of the reasons human suffering is often not given the necessary focus I think can be attributed to what I call the theory of progress. In short, looking at the numbers, there exists this perception that things are getting better and that people are better off now than they have ever been. And that has to do with a movement called humanism. And since the beginning of the movement called the Enlightenment, humanity has undergone and experienced a series of critical changes. In the episode on subjective reality, we will talk at length about enlightenment and the effects it has on us today. Talking about those critical changes I mentioned, all those changes, of course, are rooted in rational thinking. And rational thinking is the kind of thinking that guards against and fights human suffering. It has the best of intentions. It focuses on the promotion and sustaining of well-being or progress we enjoy today in our highly technologically developed societies. And in the opinion of the humanists, we can not only prove progress, but we can measure it too. Humanists, again, with the best of intentions, have been choosing, deciding, and setting the goals attached to certain standards that make for well-being.
So let's say they put a sort of standard to, quote unquote, what makes for a life worth living in our current world?
Exactly, correct. Here, now, in the 21st century, large parts of the world are experiencing progress or well-being, and it is a progress that it is tangible and it is apparent. It can be read in numbers. And the population of these places are considered in humanistic terms to be intelligent and well-educated, and people live long and prosperous lives.
Yes, we could say that large parts of such populations are affluent and have a fair shot at equal rights, at least. We could say that they have everything that they need to live long and abundant lives in seemingly safe and, comparatively speaking, free environments.
Exactly. Yet even despite these favorable conditions, we find that many of us are increasingly more lonely and isolated. We are experiencing spiritual and emotional starvation. Consciously or unconsciously, we might experience domination and manipulation. And we are dealing with the crippling effects of low self-esteem, depression, and anxiety that often is the way to addiction and substance abuse. Some of us even have emotions that are strong enough to push us to end our own lives. Unfortunately, unlike for aviation disasters, we do not have a national existence safety board that teaches us about ourselves in depth. There is little to no support for us to understand our environment. There is no cavalry ready to be deployed, nobody to open an investigation every time a person kills themselves. Mm-hmm. There is a huge difference here. If a plane or car crashes, it is not directly experienced as our fault, as there is some artifact and environmental conditions in the mix which interact or at least partly explains the occurrence. The responsibility is shared or passed compared to facing malfunctions that clearly originate in ourselves.
We live longer, we are able to cure, at least to some extent, physical trauma. We have more than enough to live by in a safe and free place where we enjoy excellent formal education, we have equal rights, we can escape misery. All this seems to be the ideal environment in theory. But then why is it that we still experience all these negative emotions and suffering? Why are suicide rates, depression, anxiety, and all these things we talked about still so prevalent in countries like Japan and the United States that are, by any stretch of the imagination, the epitome of well-developed, technologically advanced countries?
The point is that 400 years ago, the above-mentioned topics were legitimate goals. In some way, they still are. Not every society enjoys this bonanza. However, experience shows time and again that every goal turns into a step in a non-stop process called learning, and that these initial steps become the basic pillar for further exploration, care, and cure of human suffering. It is the rabbit hole, what we are talking about here. It doesn't stop to amaze me how certain people still believe that once we fully reach those goals, humanity ought to be completely happy and our existence will be fulfilled with meanings. We are terribly mistaken here. Those are just means to an end. And in the meantime, we are ignoring the issues resulting from our own doings, such as loneliness, loss and trauma, rejection, low self-esteem, guilt, rumination, failure, you name it, and many more.
So you're saying those things come from within us, and it doesn't matter where we go, we bring the seeds of those things with us, right? Absolutely. But for now, let's just say that we are fully unaware that we humans are the source of all our fragmented perceptions, and that the universe is not at all what we think it is. And the main problem is that we do not understand human nature and its ramification. And understanding human nature is critical to detecting, exposing, and proactively responding to potential system failures or dangers posed by our own build. And if we do not understand what human nature is, it is not possible to understand what its existence in itself. And questions like what is life or how can we make sense of death are rather deep questions to which the answers are only to be found deep in ourselves. Is it any wonder then that themes such as death, total freedom, isolation, or meaninglessness seem to be far too evasive, unpredictable, and hard to comprehend for our rational thinking? Well, no, and I suppose this is why we do not really know what to say when we are asked what we really, really want. We always provide kind of a ready-made answer that we've learned from some ideology or from others. We say things like, I want more money, I want a better job, I want to look different, I want to be healthier, I want more power, more influence, or nowadays just I want to be an influencer. I want to be a person that has some sort of power over other people. Absolutely. We are getting answers from everywhere. Gurus, people who are telling us what to do, what to think, what to feel, what to emote. But let me take you back to the cockpit of the Airbus 330 in 2009. So the stall warning alarm went off 75 times to warn the co-pilots of the 330 that something was amiss. And not even this deliberately loud and annoying sound, they call it the cricket, served much purpose in helping them to make sense of it or figure out what's going on or what went on at that moment. It is clear that they knew that something was wrong, but had no idea what it was or why it was failing. They had never been trained to fly under those conditions. And the same can be said from us human beings living in this era. Yeah. Because unfortunately we don't come with an instruction manual, and we don't have any loud cricket to tell us when something is wrong. While better, our warning system called feelings is far more subtle and quite a bit more complex than airplanes. And it takes the personal and collective responsibility, not to mention an enormous and humongous effort, in order for us to understand our complex nature. However, it is my opinion that we insist on living superficial lives without paying attention to our most enrooted internal divisions, and therefore we are condemned to being mere passengers in bodies we cannot understand. So when thinking about what is going on around us in the world with regards to mental health and suicide, the word pandemic comes to mind, which is funny because this year more than ever, that word has been so much in the forefront of everything we lived and talked about. And without going too much into detail about, COVID deniers and the debate about personal freedoms and topics like masks, curfews, and restriction of movement, we can take the COVID pandemic as an example of just how important cooperation is in ending or at least mitigating the risks and dangers of such a pandemic. And in a real sense, we learned this year that my action and my choices and my behavior directly influence those around me.
Exactly. Yes, it does. But I believe, or at least I desperately want to believe, that the COVID pandemic is and will be a unique event, maybe comparable to aviation disasters. We are learning expensive, hard lessons now that I hope will serve us well in the future. This pandemic is another stall warning alarm for all of us. It is clear as day to me, and I hope to most listeners too, that cooperation and global understanding of science behind COVID are the most powerful weapons we have to combat the challenges we face. But at the same time, it would be a good time for us to pay more attention and reconsider our place on the planet and our relationship with our environment and the rest of the species as well. I think we are certainly making a noble effort. I want to believe that people are standing together more than ever. I choose to see the kindness and the good things that are resulting from this crisis.
I agree. I mean, COVID-19, as harsh and as ruthless and as difficult as it has been and continues to be for us, has certainly shown us that we are adaptable and that we have limitless capacity to learn and recalibrate in our situation. And at least on a personal level, it has shown me that humans are far stronger and more resilient than what we believe we are.
Well, my concern is, unfortunately, with the bigger, more permanent pandemics like mental health and suicide rates.
Yeah.
Those are the things that, like a cancer, have a slower, less obvious effects on the global population. At the institutional and governmental level, we've seen tremendous cross-national efforts and cooperation between powerful entities. One could only imagine the good that could be done if the same level of attention and focus were to be given to the mental health pandemic too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So yeah, what you're saying is that, governments across the world have worked together and have come to agreement and have put aside their own sort of agendas in order to get ahead of this COVID thing. And if we could do the same thing for what we face,
exactly, we should do that
with regards to the human crisis. Then maybe perhaps also I think that when somebody else suffers from a mental illness, disability, or experience these things, we are not necessarily and always affected directly by it until, of course, you lose a family member, God forbid, or something like this. So I reckon that's perhaps why we are not, like you were saying, it's a slower process. It's you called it a cancer. It's not quite as shocking and novel as the novel coronavirus. So
correct. That may very well be. Although by now I think that we all might know a person suffering from some sort of emotional and psychological distress. Indeed, we might be suffering from it ourselves, unbeknownst to us.
Yeah, and I think that more and more people are becoming aware, I think, especially after being isolated for so long during COVID and being separated from friends and things. So
I agree with that. It's becoming more apparent now that we are isolated.
Yeah. So why are we then not cooperating to end this pandemic, this suicide or mental health pandemic, in the same way?
Well, according to the theory of progress, we are supposedly given all the tools and instruments to make for a happy, healthy, and meaningful existence. Unfortunately, it is my belief that there is a factor of fear, guilt, and above all, shame in looking inside ourselves, just to discover that we are the origin of our own death and unnecessary suffering. Even worse is the realization that we do not know much about the root causes of this suffering. And that is why we seem to tackle disasters better, in which we do not have full control over the sequence of failures happening. And adding highly technological artifacts to the mix helps us a lot to shift the responsibility elsewhere. But as uncomfortable or frightening as it might be, now is the time to be brave and to overcome those emotions. And it is simply essential for our well-being and for the well-being of our society and the whole world that we do look inside, that we do ask ourselves the hard questions. In the next episode, we will dig deeper into the deeply ingrained theory of progress that got into us and how suppressing its side effects is not only costing us a pretty penny, but eventually our own existence.
So join us next time on Point 1 Beyond Human Reality to dig into these topics and really talk about them in depth. We look forward to catching up with you again here. In the meantime, if you have any comments or questions, we encourage you to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Until the next time, stay safe wherever you are.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.